Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Foreign Press Association in New York, where we're celebrating is a strong word, but it appears that in that sort of alternative universe in Moscow, today might be the first day of the Crimean of the Ukrainian war, as they finally decided it mightn't be a special military operation after all. What, 500,000 casualties, add it up. It takes a lot to persuade the Kremlin of reality. One of the things this week in the unreality stakes has been, of course, the Putin election. And all of us were up all night holding our breath to check whether he'd won or not. And I'm sure there were some very anxious candidates, anxious that they might accidentally win and the FSB would be knocking on their doors minutes afterwards, since they were all. He wanted candidates to make it legitimate, but he didn't want anybody who might win or even look like he might win. So it's a bizarre world and it's a huge change. Tinatin Japaridze has been following this. For a start, she lived in it. She was born and brought up in Moscow and Tbilisi, experienced the pre and post-Soviet space, and is aware of the changes, and wrote her widely appreciated book on the ghosts of Stalin, which we've seen. So now we're addressing the poltergeists of Putin. What does this election mean? How much, looking at Putin, why did he bother having an election? Why not just call it off and say, I am voyaged for life, which, he's going to be, no matter how long his life is.
That's very true, Ian. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back. I think this is my third time actually with you all. So thank you for inviting me. Even though the topic that we're discussing today is not going to be any lighter than the previous two that we talked about. In response to your question, Ian, I think he has to a certain degree, have these elections, right? I don't think there's so much elections. I think there are these events. They're events that are supposed to celebrate his policies, not just the policy vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, but widely other domestic policies, just to keep showing him and the rest of Russia that whatever it is that he's doing, the people approve of it. I think it's more of it's a little bit like an approval rating from a pollster. He wants to see and he wants to show everyone that he is legitimate. And part of it, I think, really is him proving to himself that he's still got it. Because in many ways, he's been very much out of touch with the public, not only because of the fact that he has been allegedly living in a bunker for most of the last couple of years since the full-scale invasion, but also because he is not necessarily in touch with the grassroots movements in Russia. And he wants to remind himself that whatever he's doing is still popular, still wanted, and that he is a popular president. Now, in terms of why he's not resorting to not having elections and just becoming essentially Tsar Putin until the end of time or until the end of his time, part of it is also in light of the ongoing war, now entering its third year, and someone at some point had to call it a war, and Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, did that earlier today, finally. So now that we're talking about the elephant in the room, this is also partly a referendum of sorts. A referendum on the war, whether we call it a war or a special military operation, and also if and when, and more than likely if at this point, there is another mobilization nationwide, they want to be able to show some numbers to say that the government and the state of Russia that is calling for this rather unpopular move is actually popular, legitimate. They know what they're doing.
It's an interesting point, of course. By calling it a war, he doesn't worry so much about legality, but how does this switch in terms of being able to order a mobilization? It's one thing to sort of drag people along for a police operation. The British did that in Northern Ireland and Malaysia. The Americans did that in pre-Vietnam days. But with a full-scale war, you can demand more sacrifices and haul people off the streets and into drafts, with slightly more legitimacy, compounded with the election. How much of an element is that?
Well, first of all, I think what's interesting in Peskov, his slur, or maybe he really genuinely was told to actually call it a war, because a spade is a spade at this point. It wasn't so much that the Kremlin was trying to talk about the special military operation as a war for the first time vis-a-vis, Russia against Ukraine or vice versa, but actually as a war between Russia and the West, whether we call it NATO, whether we call it the United States, whether we call it the Anglo-Saxons, is also that's another way that Russians like to talk about the so-called West, or what they like to call the collective West. So in that respect, it becomes a war that Russia was given no choice but to fight in, because, again, the Kremlin keeps insisting that they were not the ones to start it, right? That the West essentially made Ukraine start that war. And now it has ballooned into a war between Russia and its existential, the existential threat emanating from the West, and its existential war with Western powers that want to essentially minimize Russia's role in the world. So that is a very important point for us to remember in terms of how it is that Russia is talking about the war, and whether or not Russia was the one to start the war. Of course, we all know what happened, factually speaking, but Russia, and this is not the first time that the Putin regime has had its own understanding of history, whether we're talking about 1862 or 862, or actual 2-3 years worth of events that have been transpiring lately. So it will be a bit easier, I think, for the Putin regime to try to justify if there has to be another mobilization, even though it'll be unpopular, and there will be pockets of society that will find it extremely problematic, and they will try to fight against it. There isn't a whole lot they can do. What can they do? We might see little bits of, pockets of people trying to protest, and it'll all die down very quickly, partly because the authorities will make sure that all those people disappear very, very fast, and whether they're fined or some are arrested, the message will be sent out that you better stay home. And again, we don't have any choice. They, the so-called they, are the ones that started this, and all we're doing is we are trying to essentially protect our own. And I think that's where the Ukrainian attacks against Russian mostly economic targets at the border, inside Russian territory, that will make it a little bit perhaps easier for the Russian authorities to try to justify why they have to do what they have to do, because now the war is knocking on their door, which is another reason why I think Peskov had to actually call this a war, because it's very difficult to call something a special military operation over there in Ukraine, away from the Russian households, because now the war is starting and has started to knock on its own door.
Looking at it from this metaphysical point of view, and they do, of course, a special military operation has connotations of being a police operation inside your own territory, not an external operation. If it's a war, does this hinge on, how much does that hinge on this being a war with the West rather than a police operation against dissident Nazis in Ukraine?
Well, I think initially it was exactly that. And then it has sort of become more of a Russia versus the West operation. And of course, in that case, it would be a lot harder for the Russians and the Kremlin specifically to keep calling it a special military operation. But at the end of the day, the Kremlin does not necessarily regard Ukraine as a sovereign country or even a sovereign territory. It feels that it has every right to do what it wants to on Ukrainian territory, hence calling it a special military operation, because essentially what they think they're talking about is something that's happening in their own backyard. Very Soviet, or even in this instance, post-Soviet mentality of, well, Russia inherited everything after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the Kremlin's mind, and therefore it's its way of saying that, well, we may have actually lost these post-Soviet republics after the collapse, but doesn't mean that we have lost our influence, and we intend to keep it intact.
I'm wondering whether my Swedish ancestors give me give me dibs in Rurik's Rus 861, but I won't hesitate to put my I'll hesitate to put my claim in. Now you mentioned something that's fairly important. The rumblings in Washington about Ukraine being effective in effect and their attack on military assets. So I mean, this is a really weird war where the I don't know who blew up the Nord Stream, but I applaud them, whoever they were. They did the right thing. You're cutting off the sinews of war, as the 18th century philosopher said it was, the finance with which Russia does it, and it seems perfectly legitimate to me. Here we have this weird bind that US presidents are worried that their electability might be affected by effective economic warfare on the part of Ukraine against the people who are, on the verge of genocidal attacks on them. So, I mean, how does this figure? Does anybody in Washington realize just how odd this looks to the rest of the world and how much it puts truth in the rumors that Putin is spreading about the economic rationale behind America's support of Ukraine?
Well, it remains to be seen, first of all, whether or not the Ukrainians will actually listen to the Americans in this instance, right? It's very difficult for them to take orders from Washington as aid continues to get delayed. There is a chance that it could get approved this year. There's a decent chance, but nonetheless, the fact that they've been delaying it and yet telling Ukraine essentially what to do to defend itself, because it's very difficult to look at these attacks, even those against the economic targets in Russia, as Ukraine just deciding one day, waking up and deciding that they want to attack Russian targets because they have nothing else to do. This is their way of defending themselves, one could argue, through trying to weaken Russia's economic machine that is very directly financing Russia's warfare in Ukraine, on Ukrainian territory. So whether or not the US will succeed in this, it remains to be seen. But some of the earlier statements that we saw today, in response to the article that I think we all read in the Financial Times this morning, in terms of the in terms of the US warning Ukrainians to halt these sorts of attacks against oil refineries, etc., I think it's very clear that the Ukrainians are going to think twice before they say, okay, fine, we'll do whatever you say, because again, they feel that these attacks are legitimate, and these targets, more importantly, are legitimate targets, given everything that they've endured over the past 2+ years.
But how is this? I mean, it's slightly beyond, not really, it's not beyond a remit. How is this going to play down in Washington? Because there's a certain logic here. If you're saying that here is this bastion of Western civilization that's holding off the barbarian horde, by the way, let them not do it too effectively.
Right.
And they should sit and wait to see if a bunch of crackpot Republicans allow aid to come through. I mean, it does not compute, and it does not really make for an electable position on behalf of Biden. Well, I'm temporizing, I'm treading water, hoping that the loonies in the Republican Party will let me do what we should do. But in the meantime, request the Ukrainians not to. It is not Churchillian Great War leader stuff, is it?
Well, not really, not really. And also, as you mentioned, Ian, I think it's very important for us to bear, when we talk about the US and US support for Ukraine, we have to bear in mind that this is an extremely important, if not critical, election year in the United States. So at some point, every decision, not just domestic, but also foreign policy decision, will play into essentially what will make either of the candidates more electable. So in that respect, they have to be very, very careful. On the one hand, they have to think about energy prices and what this will do to the market, the global market. On the other hand, they have to think about, well, are we actually letting Putin win over here? So it's a tough one. And I think there will be a lot of debate on how to handle this. And some of it will depend on whether or not Ukraine actually listens to these not just requests, but in a way warnings, and whether they continue doing their own thing. I mean, if they're going to use their own drones that they produce domestically, the Ukrainians, that is, it'll be very hard for someone to tell them, don't do this. It'll be a bit easier to say, well, don't use our weapons, don't use US weapons in this instance, right? But a bit harder to tell another country, a sovereign country, with their own leadership and their own decision makers and policymakers, what to do when we're talking about their livelihood and essentially survival. They're trying to survive. They're not just out there shooting various oil refineries because they've got nothing else to do. This is them fighting a war that they did not start. The other side started it, so they feel that this is legitimate.
Washington has always been, finds it difficult to comprehend that other countries have electorates and public opinion. So, I mean, there's one element, of course, is that the Ukrainians have to show, the Ukrainian government, Zelensky, has to show its own people that this war is not a one-sided, they just have to stand there and be battered in the face.
Exactly.
That they can hit back. And it's in the same
Exactly.
way that Churchill and the others, were justifiably otherwise, had to order bombing attacks against Germany, because if we're getting bombs dropped on Liverpool and Manchester and Coventry, then we have to show that they're paying a price as well.
Correct.
There's a complete neglect of Ukrainian domestic opinion in this as well, isn't there?
And there's also that sort of morale question in terms of strengthening the Ukrainian morale and weakening the Russian one. And I think there's a twofold message here on Ukraine's part. One is for domestic consumption, absolutely, because the Zelensky government has to actually show that they're doing something about this, that they're not the only ones suffering. And on the other hand, it's a message aimed, I think, to a degree at the Russian population that has in many ways, up until very, very recently, not cared a whole lot about what's happening in Ukraine because it's all the way over there. Well, it's very convenient to say all the way over there when it's convenient to say so, and then
nothing.
Exactly. So I think that there is that sort of twofold messaging intent here, and it's very interesting to see that the Russians, the average Russians that before did not really care a whole lot about what was happening in Ukraine and what their own government was doing over there, and they were essentially going off of, well, this is denazification, demilitarization, etc. of Ukraine. We have to do this because this is what we have to do. Now it's going to be a bit harder, and it's becoming increasingly harder, mostly in the border cities and the border regions, but I think it'll start to spread. The fear will have to start to spread, and to a degree, the Putin regime will have to have a message ready to go. I mean, they can't just keep saying to their constituents in Belgorod, for example, we're very proud of you being so resilient and going out there and voting in the midst of sirens and alerts and not sort of being afraid and sitting in your homes and in bunkers. But on the other hand, now if this becomes a regular occurrence, they will have to talk about it as a war, and they're already making those moves, and B, they will have to message it differently to their constituents instead of just talking about this is what we're doing in Ukraine. Actually, if the war is knocking on Russia's door, there will have to be some sort of a policy that they'll have to talk about, and the elephant in the room will have to be recognized and discussed more openly.
Well, the other aspect here is the effect on Russian living standards, which has been far less dire than many of us either hoped or expected or feared, depending which part of the spectrum you're on, when the sanctions and the war started. I mean, I think there was a widespread expectation that sanctions would introduce major economic mayhem into Russia, when in fact it's within limited parameters of a sort of an oil shade with tundra. they seem to have done fairly well.
To a degree, yes. And for the time being, absolutely agree with you that we haven't really seen any major disruptions. But I think we also need to bear in mind that Russia is operating very much as a sort of wartime economy. as a country that is essentially living through war, and therefore the economy had to make those adjustments whereby it's more of a military economy rather than just a regular economy that the Russian consumers were living under over the years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Once we see some disruptions and once we see some, let's say, dissatisfaction among average Russians in terms of their access to certain, let's say, produce in this case, if they're unable to afford things like, and you will remember this earlier in the year, there was this whole sort of movement, and I genuinely thought that it was going to turn into a bit of a protest movement, but I think it died down quite quickly. The prices on eggs and bananas, et cetera, et cetera. It's very small, and some of us made jokes about it. And, oh, you know, the price of bananas, now they're not affordable anymore. Russia needs more eggs from other countries and so on. But at the end of the day, I think those are the threats and those are the risks that the Putin regime has to keep a very close eye on. We remember this historically. That was the case in the Soviet times when not just Russia, but other Soviet republics at the time, they were actually weakened by these grassroots events and protests, not so much by the GDP, but actually, and you know, those rates, but actual day-to-day lives that were impacted of average Soviets. That was one of the waves that started to rock that boat. And the Putin government is very well aware of this. And that is why he comes out every now and then to talk about, I mean, who would have thought a few years ago that Putin would have been the one making statements about prices on eggs? But he has to, because he has to let the population know that he's got it under control. And those problems, if there are any slippages, that could become a massive issue. And if we see something trickle through from smaller cities, from sort of more from the periphery, so to speak, of Russia, where something becomes a massive problem somewhere out there, ways away from the center, from whether it's, you know, Moscow, St. Petersburg, a few other larger cities in the country, and then they gradually start to travel, those waves start to travel to the center, that could become a massive problem. And also by then, if that happens, it's a bit too late for the Putin government to try to do something about it. So they have to be very, very careful. And here he is very much having to rely on the regional officials and whether or not they're going to be very effective at this and whether or not they're going to be giving him the right and the most accurate intel is going to be very interesting, but also very hard to predict because arguably the officials in Russia, the state authorities, not just at the federal level, but also on local levels, are not necessarily as in touch with public sentiment, and they don't necessarily have their finger on the pulse as much as perhaps they would like for everyone to think they do. And, you know, not in the least because of the sheer size of the country. And also by the time something travels to Moscow from all the way the other side of the country, even with the internet and so on, it might take a minute, and it might take a minute for someone to actually get on top of something. And whether or not it's going to be a little too late by then remains to be seen. But I would keep an eye, a very close eye, on those sorts of economic developments that look very, very small in terms of their impact at the beginning, but something that could balloon a bit out of control.
Well, one of the elements here is the level of disparate socio-economic development inside Russia as well. One of the surprising things was when the Russian army first went into Ukraine, many of its troops acted like kids parachuted into a candy store. Washing machines, toilets, sinks. You know, these were clearly new technology for them, and you know, they were all. But to what extent is that still, you know, that St. Petersburg and Moscow are sort of privileged enclaves compared with the rest of it?
Oh, they absolutely are. They absolutely are. I don't think that's changed. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. As they say, it was always thus. And also, you will remember, Ian, when the 2008 war broke out in Georgia, and the Russian troops went into Gori in particular. I remember friends of mine actually told me that the Russian troops would go into their houses, into their homes, and quite literally take their toilets and sinks. I mean, this sounded like something out of a Soviet comedy from the late 60s, early 70s. And even in the 70s, they were laughing about this. But this is no laughing matter. These are the basics that a lot of these troops have not actually had access to. And they were probably shocked that they could finally get their hands on a model of a sink in a house in Gori, in this instance, one of the regions in Ukraine, that they would not have had access to otherwise, had it not been for this quote unquote opportunity.
Well, I gather that they noticed that they didn't work unless you had plumbing to connect it to, but that's another story.
Well, there is that too, yes. It's quite, I mean, it looks good, I guess. It's decor.
What about the I mean, one of the things that's been ineptly handled, well, very well handled by the Kremlin, or very ineptly handled by the West, has been rallying of international support. And we've gone over historical reasons, you know, mentioned the ghost of Stalin and
Yep.
the ghosts of the Third International that seem to hover.
Right.
How has the Kremlin managed to maintain the level of international support that it has for what everybody, even their best friends, agree was a totally illegal operation?
Well, it depends on which country we ask, right? Because for some countries, let's say in this instance for the BRICS members, Russia is a big deal. Russia was a big deal for them, and it continues to be a big deal. And now they also, in many ways, feel more noticed by Russia because Russia has less and less friends. So back in the day when Putin used to, so to speak, hang out with Merkel, Obama, and others, those days are over. So now Putin is no longer able to spend time with those Western leaders, and therefore now he has found new leaders and he has a new clique of friends. And I think in many ways these countries feel like their voice is being heard, and these sort of middle powers are feeling that they have more agency now in terms of the international stage, and how the rest of the world has to notice them, has to listen to them. And Russia is very well feeding into that narrative and that rhetoric of, you know, we are here for you. Yes, we're huge, but we also understand that you are important, and we are going to do what we can so that all of us who were otherwise in the past marginalized are going to stick together and fight against them. So it's very much sort of us versus them, which has come back in a different form, but nonetheless come back. And Putin, to a degree, is quite good at at harping on this and trying to play into those sentiments. How long that's going to last when push comes to shove, and where these countries, if they have to actually choose at some point, whether it's for economic reasons or other reasons, to side with one side versus the other, it remains to be seen which side they will choose. But at the moment, they're feeling more heard and more noticed as they stand with the Russian side, and they don't feel somehow as marginalized as they would otherwise in the international arena.
I should take a break here to point out that if anybody has questions, they can either put them in writing, or if they could give us a brief synopsis, and then we can bring them on stage, on camera, I should say, to forensically question Tinatin. Simon Locke wants to know, interesting point about the declaration of war. Does that make does that have legal implications for the use of nuclear weapons, or wouldn't the Russians care much either way?
I don't think they would care either way, honestly. I mean, at this point, if they wanted to, they would resort to these means. They haven't, and I think the chances at the moment are still rather low. I think the rhetoric will continue to get used, and it has been. And every now and then, when things go bad, Putin starts to talk about nuclear threats again. And also, it's not that he talks about it as, you know, we have decided that we are going to attack so and so, but actually that the risk has gone up. The other side may attack us, and we have to be ready for if and when and therefore if they have to fire first, then they feel that it's legitimate for them to fire first. I don't think that talking about the so-called special military operation and now talking about it as more of an outright war is going to change very much. I actually don't think that the statement that was made by Peskov today is going to change a whole lot. I think they just had to start talking about what's happening as more of a war, because again, they're seeing more and more attacks inside Russian territory, even if it's in the border regions. So they have to address it, because if they continue to pretend that it's not happening and it's only happening in Ukraine, there may be some pushback, some rather serious pushback from those constituents in the border regions of Russia.
Yeah, Peskov is an interesting character because he always gave the impression he wasn't a useful idiot. He was useful, but he wasn't necessarily an idiot. He was pliable. Yeah. So, I mean, how many people are there in the Kremlin who might be having second thoughts by now?
About the war?
Yes, about the whole
many more
experiment.
Yes, I think many more than Putin would like. Whether or not they're going to stand up against him, I'm not entirely sure. I don't think they feel that they need to right now, but there are many who are unhappy. There were many who were unhappy when the Wagner Group mutiny, the brief, short-lived mutiny happened last summer in June. There were some who in many ways felt that Russia was not aggressive enough against Ukraine, and therefore that was one of the main reasons why they sort of ended up having the problem that they had. That they should have, the military forces should have been more aware of what was happening. They should have tightened their control, not just in Ukraine, but also domestically and so on. So in some ways, there are those who are in that camp that claim that Russia should do more, not less. And then there are others who feel that it's gone a little too far. That's mostly the latter group is mostly the business elites that are, of course, suffering from this, not in the least due to the Western sanctions. And that's why we're seeing so many of them try to get out. Some are even giving up their Russian citizenships just to be able to get off of those sanctions lists. And of course, it's costing them a lot of money and a lot of assets that they're going to lose, that are going to stay in Russia, and they will have no control over them. But they feel that for reputational reasons, in terms of reputational risks, it's worth it for them. So at some point, it may come to the point where there is a little more pushback. At the moment, clearly not enough, but we have seen enough signals that there are those in the Kremlin that may not necessarily be as happy with what's happening, with what Putin is doing, with what Shoigu, the defense minister, is doing, as they would like. So in terms of a consensus, there perhaps isn't as much of a consensus, but again, there isn't enough of a lack of a consensus for them to actually try to change anything, to try to change the direction that they're moving in terms of their policies.
Simon Locke mentions with the casualties, and I think today the New York Times had a piece about, well, quite a telling piece about somebody who collects Russian bodies for a living, which was fairly horrendous. And if you see the internet footage of the bodies strewn across the steps there, it is. But do the Russians see those images? Do the Russians know how many people are involved? You know, obviously the graveyards of Yakutia and obscure tribal areas in Siberia are filling up, but what effect does that have on metropolitan Russian opinion?
And how many are really A, interested in looking, and B, actually getting access? We've seen a lot of reports that there have been problems with access to the social media platform Telegram, let alone Facebook, Meta, Instagram, etc. That's been a real problem in terms of access to information. But I would say that it's not so much just the censorship and lack of access, but there is a level of, I think, apathy in certain parts of Russia where people are not necessarily going to rush to their phones to try to get information that is not readily available to them, because it's far away in terms of mentally, it's far away for them. And they don't necessarily want to have to deal with the problem, because once they start looking at those images and they see those figures, even if they were readily available, which they're not always to an average Russian, what will that do to them? It's not going to make them feel any better. They're not going to sleep any better, and there isn't a whole lot that they can do. I mean, part of the reason why Putin was able to get reelected, if we put aside the sort of manipulation of the vote, and the vote rigging and so on, part of the problem is that many accept their fate to be Putin. And many accept what's happening to be essentially, well, this is what the cards that we were dealt, and we're just going to deal with it. We're going to live with it. There aren't a whole lot of Russians that are going to be too bothered about censorship, about lack of proper access to information that they had a few years prior. I mean, some will find it problematic, and those who find it very, very problematic will find some VPNs that will still work, even after the so-called VPN ban kicked in at the beginning of this month. But the appetite will be much less than the actual need to get the information, and the information that is available out there. It's up for grabs, but will they?
About the sinews of war, and lots of people have been talking about Ukraine's shell shortage. It's all very reminiscent of the First World War. It was the big issue in Britain, the shell shortage.
Yes.
I think my great-grandmother was a munitions worker in Liverpool.
Well, wish we could bring her back.
Well, no, because they all got poisoned in the cause of the empire. The toxic stuff in the shells, but that's another story. What about the reserves of Russia? Now, Russia had two things. One, it was preparing for World War III for 50 years. Secondly, it never threw anything away, which I always thought was a very sort of wise thing. You never know when that Kalashnikov hanging above the hearth.
That's right.
You know, when the Mongol hordes came, and you know, we'd already been demonstrated that the Vietnamese could do very well with rusty AK-47s pulled from under the swamp if the time came. But how the actual stuff that's being trundled out now is it's often worse than obsolete. It's almost self-destructive, isn't it? So how much longer can they keep this up, or are they tooling up production? Have they got a genuine war economy going, or is it just a war economy in the sense of privations and shortages?
Well, they do have some support from others, right? I mean, not in the least. There's North Korea, exactly, Iran,
Would you put
etc.
your faith in a North Korean implemented?
Well, the drones are apparently not great. I haven't seen them firsthand, but we've heard about the quality of the drones. Nonetheless, in terms of numbers, I think they have to show numbers, and they're able to show some numbers, even if the quality is not great. But that's very similar to the old Soviet model, right? It was not so much the quality that counted, but the quantity rather. So in that respect, they're able to show some numbers, and also, I mean, to a degree, yes, of course, they've lost a lot of equipment, and they're not able to fill those gaps sufficiently fast. That said, because Ukraine is struggling in terms of ammunition, that certainly plays into Russia's hand, and that's why they're hoping that this delay in terms of US aid and the diminishing factor of sort of diminishing Western supplies of aid and military equipment to the Ukrainians is going to help Russia in the long term, but they have more bodies. And that's what they're using. It's almost come to the point where they don't have all of the equipment, or they have less equipment, where there's losses on that front. Yes, there's losses in terms of the casualties of the Russian troops, but they're trying to essentially use the troops at times as weapons themselves, right? So this meat grinder that the Russian war has very much turned into for Russians is only going to accelerate. But they're looking for ways to produce their own weapons as well, and so are Ukrainians. I mean, Ukrainians announced this year that they're going to try to produce up to 1 million drones, and they likely will succeed. And these will be their own drones produced by them domestically,
Aimed at oil refineries, one hopes.
Right. Well, I was going to say they will probably be able to also use those drones to their own liking in terms of the targets that they choose, because these are not Western weapons. At some point, I think there will be another warning from Washington and so on, asking them to halt those sorts of attacks if it gets out of hand. But nonetheless, it is easier for Ukraine to then say, to respond and say that, you know, these are our own drones that we produced ourselves, and therefore we're going to do what we have to continue defending our country and our people.
How long, how much longer can they carry on?
Both sides, right? I mean, at some point, are they going to not be able to go on, and will they have to sit at the negotiating table? I think it remains to be seen when. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. They may not be able to continue at the same rate, but they will continue for as long as they can. Both will. And what happens to the front line in terms of, in this instance, Russian control of some of the territories that it hopes to gain over the next months, they're going to try, more than likely, to get what they can, primarily before the US presidential election
With a view
at the
to
end of this
a
year.
parallel ceasefire line.
Sorry, I lost you. I think I was talking over you.
With a view, well, obviously they want to get territory so that they can consolidate a ceasefire where they want.
Exactly. Exactly. That was essentially where I was going. And so they're going to do what they can. And until then, there will be no appetite in Russia, I don't think, for them to come to the table. I mean, for Russia, a peace treaty or peace negotiations are essentially Ukraine's capitulation. That's how they regard peace, is either they capitulate or we're going to continue doing what we have to do. They're not willing to actually sit down and have a conversation, a genuine conversation, any substantive sort of negotiation. And that is why the Ukrainians are less than eager to get involved, and quite rightly so.
Well, you know, that actually raises the prospect of Ukrainians getting the Samson effect and pulling the house down on them.
Mm.
There's a sort of percentage for Ukraine to say, well, damn it, if that's what they're going to do, then we're going to really go for the big one. You know, a major strike in Moscow, or, you know, let's try and blow up the Kremlin. We've got nothing to lose.
I think the less support they feel they have, the Ukrainians, from the West, if support from their Western partners in terms of weapons, essentially, started to really die down, which at the moment, it's not looking that way. It's not looking quite as dire, just given the conversations that we're hearing in Washington, that there may be an approval of the next package not too far off into the future. Then, you know, if it were to move in the opposite direction and things got really bad, they would be more risk acceptant and they would become more aggressive, because as you said, Ian, I mean, they will have very little to lose at that point. What have they got to lose other than if they were to start losing the war, they might as well go for Moscow. I don't think they're there yet. I think they were very much testing the Kremlin's patience and also trying to weaken the Russian morale in terms of the regular citizens, not so much the troops, but an average Russian, when they went for the Kremlin, quite literally. I mean, it was minor, but nonetheless. And they just wanted to basically annoy them a little bit without actually doing something outrageous, and then they would be dealing with some massive problems when Washington called. So that will be their worst case scenario, but I would be very surprised if no one in Kiev is discussing this option for the worst case scenario. I'm certain that they have many scenarios that they're looking over and they're tweaking, because they have to be ready for anything. And probably the same in Moscow as well, though it is not as certain in Russia's case that the cabinet of ministers and other advisors and the Ministry of Defense and so on at the Kremlin are going to be quite as comfortable ever going to Putin with really bad news. I don't think they want to take that risk. I think they give him curated and much milder versions of factual information when it concerns negative news that may trigger something negative in the Tsar.
Now, apart from the silo effect of
Mhm.
Ukraine and Russia, there is, of course, the US is unable to provide ammunition to Ukraine, but seems to provide unlimited ammunition to Israel for an extremely controversial and unpopular move against the Palestinians. And people don't seem to have connected these so far, not to mention Taiwan, which is a whole further issue. But in the case of Gaza, the fact that Ukraine can't be supported, but Israel, they're actually building a port on the bodies of the Palestinians to ship in food. It's fairly disquieting, and it exacerbates the bad optics in the world as well.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I'm not entirely sure that the two crises are seen through the same prism, even when it comes to not just Washington proper in terms of the US government, but also average Americans. I think their perceptions are very different when they look at these two wars, and they also see them through rather different prisms. And arguably, I mean, there was a little bit of a Ukraine fatigue right before the crisis erupted on the 7th of October. And to a degree, I think that did divert the attention away from Ukraine. And it didn't necessarily play into Ukraine's hand in terms of trying to get the support that they needed in Washington to get their aid through for the new military aid going into 2024. Whether or not that will hold, I'm not entirely sure. I think if something got really, truly out of hand in Ukraine, then people may start feeling differently going into this sort of the election year that we're in. The priorities are very much shifting. And for every move that Washington makes, they have to bear in mind that whether it's one candidate or the other, they will have to justify those moves, either for or against Ukraine, to their constituents, because those questions, yes, they're not the most popular questions when it comes to presidential debates, but I think someone at some point during those debates will ask those questions, and they have to have a very good answer, either in one direction or another, as to why it is that they're doing or planning to do whatever it is that they're planning to do.
Well, we are getting towards the end. I should take this time for a PSA. 11 o'clock next Friday, same time, same place. We have a session on Haiti and the effect on children and the prospects for Haiti, which is one of the many crises that's been overshadowed by what's happening in the Middle East and in Ukraine. And Haiti, like the Congo, has been rumbling on and swishing in blood for decades, ignored by everybody. And it reminds us what happens to crises when they carry on. They're not crises anymore. They're background noise. And obviously Ukraine doesn't want to become background noise any more than the Gazans. So it's we will do our best to maintain attention on it with Haiti next Friday, 11 o'clock. Do come along. But are there any more questions from the audience before we the killer question to floor Tinatin? Simon wants to know, how concerned are Russia's other neighbors about Putin's re-election? Is this sort of is this wow? Who'd have thunk? Or what the hell?
I don't think anyone was surprised, to be honest, including Putin, but also those who oppose him. I don't think anyone was surprised. I think it was more of the, the theatrics of, I mean, what surprised me, to be honest, in this instance was the actual percentage, 87.2, I think, according to the final CC number that they came out with yesterday. That was a bit of a surprise, but the fact itself, I don't think people are going to be more worried or less worried.
I mean, you wrote a book about Stalin's ghosts, and he was famously said it's not who votes, it's who counts the votes that matters.
Correct.
So
And I think someone in the Kremlin,
was that count accurate? Did that many people vote? I've got to doubt. We don't get 80% turnouts in the US or UK or Germany.
highly doubt it. Highly doubt it. Really. Highly doubt it. Also, I think they said that the votes abroad when they counted them up were somewhere in the 70s. I mean, that would be crazy, because most of the people who did go to vote abroad, outside of Russia, at the consulates and the Russian embassies, most of them were there, not all of them, of course, but many were there for the Noon Against Putin protest, inspired by the late Alexei Navalny. So
they're claiming 70% of the vote, was that?
Over 70% of those abroad voted for Russia, allegedly. I think it was 72 or 73, if I'm not mistaken. But that would be extremely difficult to imagine. It's a bit of a stretch, to say the least, and it's also a bit of a stretch to say that 87
It's also
of
the easiest vote to manipulate, of course.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And you saw the other three candidates. I mean, it would be very difficult to imagine that anyone would have really rushed to the polls to vote for them, unless I think many were just trying to vote for anyone but Putin. That was different. But I don't trust those numbers. Part of it is my upbringing in the Soviet Union, in the former Soviet Republic.
You spoke about the 87% as though it was
Right.
a verifiable fact, when in fact it's an
Well, it's the
unverifiable
one.
fact.
No, of course, and it's going to be a shocker if anyone actually comes out and says it was accurate. I think we've seen enough reports that demonstrate otherwise, but it is nonetheless something that is being used in the Kremlin's messaging vis-a-vis anything. As I mentioned at the top of our conversation, it was also, aside from it being a quote unquote election, it was a referendum on the war and Putin's policies over the last few years and moving into the next 6 years, if not 12. So in that respect, I think it matters in terms of what it does to the rhetoric, to strengthen the legitimacy, to cement Putin even further going into the next 6 years of his rule. So I think to a degree, that's how a lot of people are looking at it. It's not so much the 87 number, but the overwhelming support for Putin and for everything that he stands for, that the Kremlin is trying to sell to an average consumer, so to speak.
I suppose it betokens some degree of sophistication that they didn't think that 98.999% was convinced.
Yeah, that was
to Stalin.
maybe
Very well.
next time. Maybe in 2030 we might see something along those lines. Who knows?
Yes, he's working on it. He's
He is.
engaging Western pollsters and analysts to work with him. Well, it looks
right.
like we're coming to the end now. So, look, thanks very much, Tinatin. Always a refreshing sort of non-tribalistic view on Russia, because you know them, you've lived there, you've studied in Russia, you've studied in America, and of course you're well aware of the various governments in Georgia and the failings, and we must get back to Georgia at some point.
Absolutely.
With the naval base, we didn't even mention the naval base that Russians are building in Abkhazia.
No, we didn't, and we shall. We should have another one of these
Yes,
conversations closer to the parliamentary election, which will be another big one, but obviously on a smaller scale.
Yes, Putin's previous promises. Okay, well,
Right.
let's move on. This is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association. I'd like to thank Tinatin Japaridze for her contributions on the way forward from Putin. What is to be done, as one of his predecessors said, in a different context.
Right.
You like that one?
I do. Forgotten that one.
So thank you, everybody from the Foreign Press Association in New York. Please leave your names here. Let us know for future, and also future suggestions for subjects to be addressed. And if any of you are on the verge of dying and want to leave his money in the will, we're looking for funding, of course, as always, because we're operating on a shoestring. We don't take wooden kopecks, but we're perfectly open to any other currency. Please send your contributions, join, and intellectual contributions. This is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association. Thank you, Tinatin. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
New York soon. Who knows? I might be drinking when you come back, but I don't think so. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much.